Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
So I'm pleased today to have another Farthest Heaven alumnus on the show. Okay, I promise Bill Ballard doesn't have compromat on me. I just really like the books coming out of Farthest Heaven. I've got Audrey Lee, who's got a short story collection, Utter Goodness, coming out January 6th. I'm pretty sure pre-orders are closed, but
They are,
this will
yes.
be published so close to the publication date anyway. Doesn't matter. Links to that will be in the show notes. Really recommend it. Audrey, in addition to Utter Goodness, you've got 2 poetry chapbooks that I can find. Probably
Yes.
Angels.
Probably
Disjecta
Angels.
Membra.
Yes.
Yeah. And I really liked Utter Goodness. It's there is a difficulty to describing short story collections, but I feel like there are consistent themes between all of these stories. I felt that relationships at a distance is what kept coming up for me. There's distance between people because of secrets, infidelity, sex, memories, death, like Kaylee in Yellowstone, belief, like the doctrine of utter goodness, one's past, one's former identity in one story, The Swans. And the distance doesn't have to be negative. Like, it's very, very sweet in 2 days straight. There's also this sense of observation. That's difficult to separate from distance. It's like in the story Oysters by the Dozen, you've got this character of the Baron who just seems to be everywhere watching. God's often brought up as distant yet watching. There's the prophet Dali John is always this hovering presence between Jeb and Junie in the title track of this collection. Anyway, does that sound about right to you? Me introducing all of these stories. I can go into all sorts of other parts about how they're written. There's a wonderful quality of them feeling like they stop just before before you think they should stop. There's so much experimentation in the prose style. Anyway, does that sound about right?
I would say you hit it very well on the head there. I think that some of the theme, whenever anyone asks, oh, what's your book about? What's your short story collection about? The first thing is like, I have 13 stories in there. Like, which ones do you want to hear about first? And then if you give someone like, again, more of an amalgamous collection of, it's about the surveillance state, it's about the sort of overarching gossip and watching. And again, I really liked how you worded relationships from afar. Then it's like, okay, so what is it about? But I really do think you hit it pretty well on the head there. Those are a lot of the themes that the work surrounds. Relationships from afar was one that I do think is a really good one to mention to start off as, because I think relationships between men and women make up so much of the collection, whether it be friendship or romantic relationships. Again, infidelity. There's one in there which is American Girlfriend, that I can only frame as like the weirdest like sugar baby setup that you could possibly fathom. And when we were starting to parse through the collection, he was, I was mentioning pulling in or taking out 2 days straight. And he's like, I think this is a really good story about how men and women do interact in relationships. And I think that hitting these different types of relationships on the head, again, from afar, there is such a judgmental quality to them. Someone is always watching and partake, whether they are doing it more subconsciously or objectively, placing their opinion on these relationships. And a lot of the time, I think it's some sort of interest I have in like gossiping. I tend to be not a very gossipy person in real life, of all things, but oh my gosh, do I love my characters to have like something to say about someone else in their story. It's really fun to write. I think it comes from a place of like, I spoke about this the other day with a friend. I don't always like to make my characters feel a lot of emotion, or at least show a lot of emotion, but they will show their opinions. They almost come across as like these snickering, like, gossip columnists at some point, which I find really fun to write.
Yeah, I love how character driven each of these stories is, because each of these really is like you said, it's gossipy. It's just putting under a microscope, with the exception of maybe 2 Days Straight, which I think was a very nice palate cleanser of just quite a sweet, hopeful relationship. But on the whole, these are quite dysfunctional people in unusual situations. Some of these characters are so memorable. I just love Cliff Gonzo, which I definitely will ask about more. I like you mentioning gossip, though, because I did read, I think it might have been on Substack, you said, I don't want to kill my darlings, but I do want to judge them. And that sums up so much of this book. I guess, how much of literature do you reckon is refined gossip? And for example, I'm reading The Count of Monte Cristo at the moment, and that is about 1,200 pages of mostly gossip, like very elaborate gossip.
Yeah.
But it's very gossipy.
I read, and I mean, I would say most of the books I read, which is a lot, are like literary realism. And for example, I read, in the theme of a very long book that is mostly gossip, I read Proust's In Search of Lost Time between last year and earlier months of this year. And I mean, that is 4,000 pages of Marcel Proust giving you his play-by-play of his obviously involuntary memory, and then more thoughts about said involuntary memory and his thoughts on everyone around him. And it's such people think of Proust as very dense. Oh my gosh, it absolutely is. But it's also it can be such a fun book to read because he is ridiculously salacious and gossipy, and he's, calling these women like whores. He's being like, my redheaded lesbian girlfriend who I'm so in love with is like with another woman. Like, it is such a funny book, but a lot of it is him sort of like whispering to you to the side, like, and this person actually sucks. And so I think a lot of, especially realism, in that is what I would probably, if you had to, define utter goodness in a genre, that is what I would throw utter goodness into. It's certainly not a genre book, in the ilk of fantasy, sci-fi, what have you. And one of the things too that I will mention, and something that I was working, and I'm going to tangent a lot, something that I was working on with Phil on this is that in selling, in working like about the marketing and selling of this book, a lot of women's writing, and I'm not knocking this, I love these books, love some of these books in their own way. A lot of women's writing right now tends to be the very like autofiction. I don't know if I'm just a girl is a way to put it, like your years of rest and relaxation, where it's very much this disaffected lamenting, but still very, it comes from that first person point of view, gossipy character, who, although maybe very disaffected and tries to, separate herself from the world around her, still becomes this, omnipotent judge of what's going on around her. And obviously in those books, I think a lot of that, I think it's hard to say how much is pulled from real life and how much is obviously invented. But I think just by basis of women's literature, you're going to get much more like of that gossipy, salacious, here's what I think about this person. And they tend to be very honest in that way too, which doesn't always happen with that disaffected voice. And I think that in Marketing Utter Goodness, we were immediately like, this is not one of those books. We've already, you've brought up, which to be fair, we bring up relationships in the book. We've talked a lot about this again, the gossipy quality of it. And a lot of those are qualities that I think get applied to women's literature, although I would not call this book in particular at all women's literature or that very disaffected. None of these characters are very disaffected. I think they're very involved in their real worlds. But
Yeah.
I think in particular when we were selling the book, we were like, as much as a recognizable like marketing strategy as it can be, we can't do that for this book. It just wouldn't make sense at all. And so it's certainly something where I think there's plenty of especially contemporary literature that pulls from this gossipy, almost tabloid quality, especially in women's writing. And it's something that I think is very fun to play around with. Obviously, I had a lot of fun with it in Utter Goodness.
Yeah. I really like something you said earlier about how these characters might not feel so much.
Yes.
And one aspect of the characterization I really liked was the sense that I think these characters do feel a lot. They just don't quite know how to express that or how to verbalize it. I think the ostrich economy is a really good example. It's the second story in this for listeners, and it was like there's a point in the ostrich economy where you jump forward, some period of time very suddenly, and it was then where I was like, okay, yeah, I'm on board with this collection. I'm really interested because the main character in it, like something, I don't want to spoil things for people, but his life's kind of turned upside down, and he's obviously acting from a place of obsession, being emotionally wounded, but he doesn't quite know how to think it through. His actions and his inner monologue are kind of saying different things, and that pops up again and again and again. And I really like how elegantly you portrayed people at odds with themselves, or people's psyches at odds with themselves. Were you meaning to do that, or is that just that you got to know these characters well enough that this just emerged fairly naturally as you were writing them?
I think that that's something where when I first started writing that story, it's something that emerged over time. And it's something, again, like you mentioned, it comes up again and again. It almost gives these narrators like a very unreliable quality to them. I think that, and you're absolutely right. Like in my wording there, it was like, oh, I don't let these characters feel it. They feel a lot. They don't want to show it. They don't want to be vulnerable about it, is what I should say. They're not a character that is going to beat you over the head with like, man, my girlfriend. I'm not going to spoil it. But
Yeah.
when I also wrote Harvesting Bunnies, that was one that we actually worked through quite a bit, revised very heavily, I would say. But what, Harvesting Bunnies originally started off as, which I'll give some context, is one of the stories in the collection, and it's this housewife. She breaks her leg. She's very obsessed with this idea that her husband is going to kill her because she is not performing up to the expectations that she normally tries to achieve, which very much are set by herself. And it becomes this, and again, I'm not going to spoil it, but it becomes this sort of like tug back and forth where she has also that obsessive personality about her, where she also is a bit of she's also somewhat in denial about her personality, where she doesn't really want to, and it's so hard to talk about this without totally spoiling it, but she lives in this sort of state of fear that is totally her delusion and imagination about her husband, until she sort of becomes this person that she fears, but is seeing it as like a very righteous thing. And I think that was a really fun one in particular to write, because I was not as interested necessarily in writing like a scorned wife narrative, as much as that narrator wants to parse it off. But that difference between her actions versus what she's, what she's actually doing, which is just insane stuff, couldn't be more different. And I think that's something where in writing these stories, it's never something I want to hit the writer or the reader over the head with. But it's really fun for these characters. No, fun is not the right word. I'm putting these characters through like absolute hell. But they're like all going through it, but it's so, like, they're like, trust me, man, like, I really don't care about her. I really don't care about him. And then they're getting on a plane and flying to nowhere away from their problems. And I'll
Yeah.
leave it at that so I don't spoil much further.
Yeah, it's tough not spoiling things because what's the word count for most of these stories? Because they're very terse. Even American Girlfriend felt like the longest, and that's not a particularly long story.
American Girlfriend, I think, is about 3,500 words. And I did, in the way we organized it too, and there's a lot of stories that are a lot shorter. They're almost, I think the shortest in there is Engineer. It's about 750 words. And a lot happens in that story as well. It was such a fun challenge to pack as much as I possibly could into like that sub 1,000 word space, and which didn't even start off objectively as that challenge. I can talk about that more. But most of these fall in the about, I'd say, 2,000 to 3,000 word range. I think a lot of that comes from that and I'll talk a little bit about process here. Whenever I start off a story with just an idea that is way too big for a short story. This is sort of where American Girlfriend, which is the closing story in the collection, becomes its very special thing, because I started off with an idea that is probably way too big for its container, but still did it. And usually a lot of these stories start off in a very different version, and they have very high stakes, and they still have very high stakes in them and very large goals. And I have to be like, there's no way I can pack this all into 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 words. And so they become a snippet of, I'll take something from a scene from the original couple drafts, and it turns into the story. I think that Men's Unlimited, Mr. Cliff Gonzo is a very good version of this. That story started as like so for context again, that is a story about a reporter going to a bodybuilding competition in Vegas in the 90s. And that started off as like a 3-day coverage from like the reporter's writing, like as it would have been published in this fictional magazine, Men's Unlimited, of that bodybuilding competition. And I was like, there's no way you're going to fit 3 days, like in the way you want it to be, of a 90s Vegas bodybuilding competition and all its utterly spray tanned and Schwarzenegger glory. And that is like a novella or a novel length story. And so what that became is just this reporter doing an interview with this just utterly roided up bodybuilder. So that is like somewhat of the process of this. So they do tend to be that terse, that very like contained size. I'm recalling words here, excuse me. Because I think they start off as such larger ideas, but they end up becoming, and this is not to any complaint, I'll mention, like I love to get into such the granular pieces of these stories. They end up becoming these snippets, and I really like how that process works for me in particular.
That makes a lot of sense, because the sense I got from all of these stories is that, like you said, they're very terse, they're very short, but you always get the impression that they're embedded within a much, much, much larger story. Like the story extends far before the writing starts and then continues long after. Especially because of that quality that I've mentioned a few times now, but it might be the most striking quality of all of these stories, is they always end a second before I think they're going to end. And even though I've read 13 of them now, it still gets me every time. It still ends maybe a paragraph before I think it's going to, which has this nice quality of almost setting the reader up on a trajectory and like blasting you off. And you keep thinking about what might happen once the story's finished. But yeah, that's making sense now that at least these started in your head as much larger pieces. So have you written out the whole piece and it's much longer, or you've thought it through a lot and you're just subtracting bits until you get to maybe like 800 to 3,000 words, or however long the particular story is? How are you getting to these finished pieces from that larger idea that you initially have?
Yeah, and I'll touch first on your first part of that, where they end that second before, because I know you mentioned this on your interview with Bill as well, the editor, the just fantastic editor in chief of Farthest Heaven. I am, of course, I'm on the press, but I cannot thank Bill enough. I'm going to plug him here. I'm going to embarrass him. I'm going to thank you, Bill, for picking this up and for all the work he's done on it. He's a fantastic editor, and that shows through all out of Farthest Heaven's books. But when you mentioned that on your episode with him, I was like, oh my God, he's right. And that's maybe something where I almost, when you said that, I thought of it in the way of like, in a very childish way, where it's like when you're a child, you're a kid, and you're in trouble and your mom has just found out and you're like, oh shit, like what, this is going to be awful. I'm going to feel so much. And maybe this ties back to the idea of letting my characters feel it a lot, but they don't want to show it. And so I found that it really something that I hadn't considered in my work before, but to be very, like, again, a good observation that like just did not occur to me. I'm like, oh yeah, I really do that. And part of it is I sometimes think that there's a lot of fallout that can happen after a lot of these stories that I'm just not as maybe interested in covering. They need to exist in their snippet of time. Oysters by the Dozen, I think, is an interesting case of this, because a lot of that story, which that's, again, I'll go into the slight summary, which is takes place in Texas, in Denton, in the 70s. I can tell you a little bit later about how that story came to be. I think we're gonna have a fun discussion about characters, but that is one where it ends with this guy who gets pulled into a marijuana smuggling operation in Galveston, and I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but it ends with him knowing that I'm going to jail, and this is the end of my very short and very uneventful but very tragic life. And you don't see much fallout after that. I didn't write about like him going to trial or going to jail, or picking up a lot of his old habits. And I think part of that is that these lives are very segmented. And sometimes the fallout that might happen, and the stakes in my stories tend to be high as well. And I sometimes think that I'm not as interested in the logical fallout that would happen after a lot of these stories. I think it would just turn more into like, so then this happened and then this happened. A lot of them would probably take up like a legal process, or just almost have an instructive quality to them. And I'm much more interested in that very messy in between of when things are happening. And also I'm like, man, do I really want to write the same feeling that everyone feels when they're a kid and they got in trouble and their mom's like, you're in such trouble? And the answer is no, I don't want to write that. I will. But, and a lot of these stories, like you mentioned too, when I start to write them, they take on several drafts, I will say. A lot of that is almost less of when I start to write, it's less, the goal is less to finish the story, but more to figure out where the story actually starts. So there's just drafts upon drafts of stories, and, I'll come back to Men's Unlimited, where this started as the narrator in this story, starting off watching like these men wrestling in a bodybuilding competition, and goes into this 3-day ordeal. And on it, that is like a novel or like a novella I would love to write. And a lot of these are like novels and novellas I would love to write. And so sometimes I have more concrete ideas of like, this is what happened before, this is what happens immediately after. And so I would say it depends. A lot of these also take on, even within their small containers, different forms. I tend to write them all at once. I'm someone where it's like, I don't write like 200 words and sit down and come back to it the next day and so on and so forth. I'm someone who's like, it's 10 p.m. and I'm feverishly typing something out and it's going to be done in 3 hours. It may be awful. It may make no sense, but I'll figure that out later. And so I think that's something where, I haven't written in whole most of these stories. A lot of them have different beginnings, and I do know the endings of a lot of them, but it's more just I have to do that practice to figure out where does this story actually start in the way that I think I want it to be told.
And in that writing process, how soon do these characters appear to you? Because they're the stars of the show in basically every story. Like they're what make the stories really interesting. Like someone like Cliff Gonzo or the wife in Harvesting Bunnies, who is like initially you feel bad for her, and I guess that persists. But as time goes on, she just seems more and more unhinged.
Yeah,
Or the
absolutely.
main character in the Ostrich Economy as well. Like, how soon do these people announce themselves, and I guess you want to explore them, and how often do they kind of emerge from, I don't know, from I guess like the competitive mental illness of a 1990s Vegas bodybuilding show or a high-end fitness club.
I would say the character is something I always start with. That is like the striking moment. And I wouldn't say it's like, oh, I get an idea for this character and then I build the story around them. If I told you, which I'm going to, where I get some of the inspiration for these stories, you're going to look at me with like, what is wrong with you? I mean, Men's Unlimited started from a Bronze Age pervert tweet. I'm not even kidding. Like it started from specifically a tweet involving the phrase Hawaiian style. And that story, like just go search it. I don't do that actually, but and I'm making myself sound very terminally online here. Ostrich Economy started with actually another tweet I saw about like the cost of buying an ostrich egg versus what you can sell those ostriches for. And so I was like, that's really interesting. What if I had a story about someone going through that process and in that sort of natural, like profit, mechanism there and I was thinking too, there's a lot of animals that have that. You have ostriches, you have koi, that it's like you buy them cheap, you raise them over a certain period of time and you can have extremely high profits in selling them for whatever. I think I was talking about someone there like, oh yeah, like that Fortran shrimp farmer. And I was like, don't go into that. But, that was one where it started with that natural like economy idea of buying and selling and turning a profit. And that's where I got the idea for the ostrich economy of, well, what if I made this guy in the heart of the economy in Wall Street, an investment banker? And it sort of spiraled from there. And he's very much wrapped up in this very yuppie, very New York, finance life. He's a Henry, which is high earner, not rich yet. And, is very much involved in these social groups of like Soho House. He's involved in, he's obviously very heavily involved at work in these very nice Christmas parties. His girlfriend wants a $19,000 Hermes Birkin. And I think that and at the time I wrote this, I was also working in New York. I live in Philadelphia. I was commuting up. So I was very much, surrounded by this world at that time. And it's something that I'm partaking in this. It's also fascinating. I'm looking at this from both a participant and an observer, like some sort of like anthropological study. And I think that pulling that in with the natural idea of like buying an ostrich egg and then selling the skin and the meat and the feathers for a lot more later was, natural progression is one way to put it. It's probably not a natural progression, but that was, for example, the way that I pulled in this character for the ostrich economy. So that's like one example of that. And I talk a lot too, like this is a collection that is also very grounded in place. I don't think you could take what happens or the plot of any of these stories out of their settings and put them into another setting. They're just not something that can happen in a vacuum. And I'll take like, again, Oysters by the Dozen, for example. I wrote about this on Substack, but the Baron is very much inspired by this guy, Rex Cobble, who was Coble Cobble. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But in the 70s in Denton, he was, and there's this fantastic article, I think in Texas Monthly about this, that this is going to be a long story. I was going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole. I was reading about the RICO Act here in the U.S., and which is how they, prosecute like organized racketeering crime, stuff like that. That's how if you're in like a gang or the mafia, that's what they'll charge you under. And I was the first group that was charged under the RICO Act was this cowboy mafia. And I was like, well, that's a fantastic term. Let's look into
Right.
these guys. How can I see something like cowboy mafia and not immediately be like, oh my God, what is this? And it was this group back in the 70s that smuggled marijuana from Colombia into the United States. And they were mostly ranch hands in Texas, but they were bankrolled by this guy, Rex Cobble, who was a very public figure. He ran like a Western wear store. He very much like in the story, he raised and bred and made quite a bit of money off of these rodeo horses that specifically partook in cutting, which is also in Sandwich Exotica. That is the rodeo competition that character takes place in. I'll tell you about that too, but back to this, the guy who was bankrolling that, Rex Cobble, he was so glitzy, had like Swarovski, like cowboy hat and very shine stud, spurs on his boots. He was seen as this very gaudy, very flashy, local businessman who had been very successful, did a lot for the community, and was also a very outspoken person against marijuana. For reference, in my own personal life, I hate marijuana. I am probably the most, in the city of Philadelphia, I may be the most like anti-weed person, but I found it so funny. Like, oh yeah, this guy is like, this stuff is going to kill you. And then he's bankrolling this entire operation in the background. And so that was what originally was like, oh my God, I need to write about this. And the Oysters by the Dozen is very obviously heavily inspired by that story. But I didn't necessarily want to write it from Cobble's point of view. As much as I loved his character, I was like, I want to make this a very fictionalized story. I don't want to pull directly from that character, but making him this, again, he was a very public figure, and making him into this story, into the Baron, where he is this omnipotent, ever watching figure that kind of follows this very low down on the totem pole. The narrator is like mucking horse stalls before he gets brought into this. He's got a lot of problems, and making the Baron, this very glitzy public guy, into this sort of almost evil Eye of Sauron sort of character was really fun, because I got to take that glitz and that flashy, gaudy. You're going to hear me say the word gaudy a lot. I love this sort of American excess that a lot of these characters inhabit. I find it so fascinating. It's one of my favorite things to write about, and not even from a critiquing level. I am just so obsessed with it. But then make him this like sort of decrepit, wrinkled, scary guy in some ways was a really fun thing to write about. So I think this is like somewhat of an idea of like, again, where I totally went off on a tangent, but where I pull these characters from it'll usually start with either the character, or it'll start with like something like a tweet of all things, and then transform itself into the ostrich economy, if you will.
Yeah. Because I think I read something you wrote about American Girlfriend, one of the characters there, you based on someone you met on a ski lift, or you're like someone met on a ski lift?
So, oh my gosh, yeah. So again, I'm going to keep this very anonymous, because although something tells me that the person I met on a ski lift, nor her ex-fiance, will ever hear about Utter Goodness. But my sister, I was like skiing with my family. This is years ago. And I was taking a break, boots hurt, whatever. My sister comes barging into the ski lodge, like, you're never going to guess who we met. And I'm like, we had already met Phil Dunphy from Modern Family at said ski resort. So I'm like, I don't know, Phil Dunphy again. And she's like, we met this woman. And again, this is like this very gossipy quality. My sister and I love her so much. Me, and my mom have this very like, this is where I will gossip. I gossip with my sister and my mom. And she's like, we met this woman. She had like hair extensions, bright purple lipstick, metallic ski suit. And I'm like, well, yes, this is like a ski bunny. And my sister's like, no, like the first thing she tells us, like most people do not talk on the ski lift. She immediately started talking. She's like, the first thing she told us is that she's 25 and her fiance is 75. And I was like, this is fantastic. Who is this woman? We found her later on Instagram. And because of course we did, like she had given my sister her full legal name and like life story. And she's like a Playboy model. She's an aerial contortionist. Her fiance is 75 and friends with Hugh Hefner. And he was, and again, this is someone where I'm like, oh, I'm not going to give too much into that one because he partially inspired, obviously, the old guy in American Girlfriend. And that woman on the ski lift sort of parsed out into, I think, both the Daisy character, maybe not as much the Anna character, and maybe not as much the narrator, maybe a little bit the narrator. But I think this, like, that guy and that whole background ended up starting this weird idea of American Girlfriend where I'm like, I love this, like, ski bunny. She's totally an escort, like, but she's trying really, she may not be trying hard to try it. She willingly told my sister on the ski lift all this, but I was like, this is such a funny story, and these are such good characters that are just, again, could not exist in a vacuum. You couldn't take this guy who's friends with Hugh Hefner, and there's, I Googled him, and there's the articles. He's a CEO of a company. There's these articles about him of like his third wife jumped out of, he said 5 wives. His third wife jumped out of a like birthday cake on his birthday, totally topless. And that's how they got married for the next several years. But, and then he had a 4th wife. Anyways, so on and so forth. And it's this very nouveau riche, flashy, gaudy again thing that I'm like, this is so funny and so reality TV, and almost how do I make it not reality TV and not as like tacky, trashy like that, while still being like, this is tacky and trashy. And that was one, I think, in particular, where those characters were definitely pulled from real life, but I think are also very recognizable. The idea of, so yeah, that is an example of that story in particular too. So my dad's side of the family were expats in Southeast Asia for most of my dad's childhood. And so we have a ton of, my grandma, my grandpa, my dad, there's every holiday, tons of stories about living in Thailand and Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong. And I'd always been interested in writing about that. And I'll be honest, I don't know what part of me was like, I'm going to connect this to these utter freaks from a ski lift. But I think part of it in particular was this, like, where I'm like, again, these characters are so uniquely American. They're so nouveau riche. They're so flashy. These aren't people who came over on the Mayflower. These are people who made it big off of like Bible sales, to secretaries, and or off of just another more profitable, lucrative industry that obviously has, a lot of risk to it, and pulling in that very contemporary American idea of the nouveau riche from someone who has an idea. And again, the narrator in the story is an expat, and she comes back to the US, and she's very disconnected from this life. And I wanted that idea of like someone who is so objectively an outsider, yet is somehow still familiar with it and has always been, in Thailand. She grows up in Thailand, had this American identity. Oh yeah, you're the American girl. You're from America. You speak English. You're blonde. You're beautiful. When she comes to America, she's like, what the hell is going on? And I felt like that was a very fun sort of like, again, distance to write from. And that's where that story, again, continued from.
Yeah. And like a number of your stories, actually, now that I think about it, almost the character whose actions the main character is responding to, or the characters that you spend time with, is quite often distant. Like, the wealthiest man in Indiana doesn't really show up in American Girlfriend. It's like, Prophet Dali. Oh, was it Dali John or something? I forget his exact name. Yeah. How like you hear recordings of his voice in Utter Goodness, but he doesn't appear as a character in the same way that Jeb and Junie do, or the Baron. How quite often, I just thought of this when you were talking about the character in Oysters by the Dozen and his relationship to the Baron. It often feels like we've got the perspective of someone standing next to someone really important or interacting with them from a distance. Were you going for that in all of these stories? I know you mentioned that you liked that dynamic in Oysters by the Dozen, but were you intentionally trying to do that with basically all of these stories?
Yeah.
Or is that just something you find interesting and have turned up just by pursuing these characters?
I don't think it's something that I necessarily thought through for all of these stories. There's certainly some of the ones you mentioned in particular that, this happens more often than not. And it's something that I'm very interested in it. And, I'm Christian. My faith has been something that has, both become more important in my life. I didn't grow up, I grew up we call ourselves like Creaster, Christians, which means we go to church on Christmas and Easter. And, I'm 27 now, when I was about 22, 23, I started going to church for the first time in my life. And now I go to a Catholic church. And I think and I was going to like Episcopalian. So it was a lot of figuring out where I was at that point. And some of these stories started off well before, or at least the ideas for them started well before I, took my faith became a much larger part of my life. And it's always something I think subconsciously I've been super interested in, and how both people are searching for, and I think this appeared in my life, how people are searching for something or that spiritual emptiness inside of them, and whatever they end up replacing it with, and how important that can become to them, whether it necessarily is good for them or not. And this is a book that I wouldn't say it's not Christian fiction. It's not explicitly like a Christian book, but I think it does have this sort of like sub-commentary on faith and where, when you're putting your faith in something and you're searching for your spiritual life, the things that you can, sort of replace that. I'm not going to like evangelize here, but the things that might replace God in that spiritual life, and what you would almost, in this case, it's cult leaders. In this case, it's bosses. And I think I'm going to pull from Utter Goodness, which is the title story in particular here. It follows these two people, man and a woman, who are part of this cult, led by the prophet Dolly John. And I think that keeping that keeping the people that these people want to follow, or these causes that these characters want to follow in particular, at a distance, I think it makes, how do I want to word this? Like, it makes these people, I'll use Dolly John, for example, again, godlike, and gives them more of a cause. It's almost like, I also think of like a celebrity, or like a stan of a celebrity in this case. You're distanced obviously from that celebrity, but you're a follower. They give your life some interest and purpose. And I think that, writing it from a distance, it also provides that sort of like, again, I talked about this omnipotent quality of a lot of these things that people are searching for and following, in Dolly John and the Baron, so on and so forth. And a lot of these characters in those stories in particular, I think, are very lost. I think in Utter Goodness in particular, like Junie and Jeb, they're not, they talk kind of weirdly. They don't really know what, they all have come there for a reason. They've all come to this ranch where Dolly John has started his cult for a reason, and they're very devout. But I think that I position Dolly John at a further distance. He only really comes up actually speaking in tapes that they're listening to, and then in one scene where he's showing the narrator how to butcher a cow. And I think, that is also like a memory. And I think that keeping these characters at a distance, makes them, both in their minds, much more susceptible to be a follower, and also gives this much more like, scary is not the right word, but like ominous, off-putting quality to people that they're working for or following. I will mention something about utter goodness, which is, I think, a funny side tangent. That was a phrase that was bumping around in my head for months. No story attached to it yet, but I was like, utter goodness, utter goodness. This is going through. So I ever write a short story titled Utter Goodness. And I wrote what is now Utter Goodness. And I sent it to Anna Kriva-Lipova, fantastic writer. She's also has a novel coming out with Farthest Heaven, fantastic friend of mine. And she's like, oh my God, I love the double entendre of like utter, like a cow. There's a lot of cows in that story. And I was like, oh my God, I totally blew the chance to use this like utter goodness, like this title for something. I'm like, it's a cow story. It's a story about cows. And I did not intend for that like double entendre of utter and utter to happen whatsoever. But I was like, I don't think I can change it now. I think that's what the story is called. So, and then it was also like, and now it's the collection. We were very careful. We cannot put a cow on the cover of the book.
I really like you talking about how so many of these characters are looking for something durable or some sort of stable ground. Because, again, I just immediately thought of Cliff Gonzo when you were saying that, how he's got that whole speech about how he was a loser before he jumped on gear and became the strongest man in the world. And then in a moment of passion, I did really like this detail. He just lets slip that he is aware that he's the second strongest man in the world.
Yeah.
And he's not the strongest. And then he flips out. So even though he's ostensibly, at least according to his own PR, achieved that status or the position that he's been working so hard to achieve, it hasn't brought him any peace. It's I was wanting to ask about where in these stories is God, because I could feel that in the background. Of course, you'll have churches and things appear, like Sparkle Time, I think is it takes place around a church, even though the character in that story says that he doesn't believe, like he's just there for the girls at church. I guess maybe if it isn't too vague a question, and to an extent you've answered it in part, where is God in these stories? Is it something that people are trying to get to, but are never quite arriving at, and they're approaching it through things like taking tons of steroids or working in banking?
Yeah, I get what you're asking. And I can jump just off of there for a second.
Yeah.
And so again, like I went to an Episcopalian high school. I grew up, again, not very non-denominational, but I started when I started going to church, I'm like, well, what do I know? I know Episcopalianism, I know Protestantism. So I definitely started off when I started going back to church in my faith, and two more Protestant churches. And, I started off going to Episcopalian church, and then I went to Anglo-Catholic church, which is a weird offshoot of Episcopalianism that looks more towards the pre-Reformation idea or like pre-Reformation, Protestant Reformation, Anglican church. And, well, not really. This is I'm not here to discuss what Anglo-Catholicism is. I don't think most Anglo-Catholics could probably really thoroughly explain that. But, and now going more to Catholic,
you can if you want, but you're not.
I'm not here to talk theology. And I will say, like, utter goodness is not grounded in like a theological argument. It's not something that like I was reading theology to write whatsoever. And so there's probably some, theologists around here who would, or maybe if there's someone watching this who are going to be like, this woman is insane, she's wrong. But I think that utter goodness particularly pulls from an American Protestant tradition, which is very different from a Catholic tradition in that you have these values of like community and the greater good. One of them in particular that I I think defines of Protestantism very much from Catholicism is that in Protestantism, it is built on your personal relationship with God. You go to God, you pray to God. And in Catholicism, you pray to a saint and you pray, or you speak with someone higher in the church. And it's not as much, it's more in service of God than it is having that one-on-one with God. And so I think that American Protestantism in particular, it's such an interesting topic because there's so many, like, oh my God, and I've traveled a lot across the country. I keep saying I've lived in a lot of parts across the country. I always joke, like, I live in Pennsylvania. I went to school in the most Amish county in the United States. And I live in a very Quaker part of the country too. And then I moved to Utah for a little bit and I lived with the Mormons. So I've always lived with these very like sort of offshoot splinter groups of Christian religion, which I find really funny. And I end up learning a lot about them. And I really like all these groups. I really like the Mormons in particular. We can get to that later. But as much as I don't agree with their whole premise. That being said, a lot of these characters, I think, approach their faith from that American Protestant tradition of like, I am not joining a larger organization. What I am looking for in my faith is me to whatever your God is going to be. And right now, I think in America, a lot of people place their faith, or place where God should be in their spiritual life into politics, or they place it into another cause before they might go to a church. And that becomes their one-to-one. I think that and so I think it comes from somewhat of that. It's definitely not a Catholic book under any sort of thematic ideas. But I think that's one in particular where God is something that, whether they know it or want, most of them don't know it. Most of them, and that was probably subconsciously done by me at the time, most of them don't approach God from the idea that they know that they want or need God in their life, or that they're missing something in their spiritual life, but they are searching for something. And in this case, they are in the I'll use Oysters by the Dozen. This guy is an alcoholic. He's out of rehab. What does he need? A job. He searches for his meaning in this baron who hires him. I'll even pull from like the Swans here, where it's like this woman is living and working and has basically built her life under a different identity, and where she came from at the time and what she is now and how much she has achieved in that is something that I think she's always been searching for. And I think a lot, so where is God is such a vague question because I'm not sure exactly where, but I think of it as almost like these characters have my high school, I'll pull from this, again, Episcopalian, the motto was Esse Quam Videre, which is mind, body, spirit. And actually that's not it, but the idea of mind, body, and spirit was very important in that. And I feel like a lot of these characters are missing that spirit part of their life. And so they're trying to, whether they want to or not, it's this part inside them that they, and I'm not here to evangelize. And it's something too that in writing post becoming Christian, and figuring out my Christian faith, I'm not someone who likes to evangelize. I'm not someone who has ever approached that well. And I never received it well either before I started going to church. And so I think these characters are all searching to fill that spiritual hole in their life. But whatever they fill it with, it can be anything. And I think it's really fun to read. And some of these stories in hindsight, and also thinking forward, there's some newer stories that I'm writing as well in that. Does that kind of answer the question? I know you've mentioned that was like more vague, but I think that was somewhat of an answer. Yeah.
That was a great answer to, at best, half a question that I gave you.
What was the other half? Oh my gosh.
I did like to, in light of what you said then, how you've, you start the book with Sparkle Time and end it with American Girlfriend. And I don't know if this was intentional or not, but I feel like there are just so many resonances between these two stories. It almost feels like Sparkle Time and American Girlfriend are examining kind of similar things and from different positions. And they even call back to each other, I think, with the amen, 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 amen lines. But the relationship of both characters in these stories, or both main characters to God, is interesting. Because in Sparkle Time, it's from the perspective of someone who doesn't believe in God and is attending church more or less, so he can perv on some of the girls at church. And in American Girlfriend, the main character seems to, she in some way feels bad about how she's been living and keeps appealing to God as this, like, the moral arbiter, but isn't quite willing to make that jump to change her behavior in light of that. But did you write these stories with their counterpart in mind? Like, were you writing American Girlfriend with Sparkle Time in mind, or vice versa? Or did this emerge when you and Bill were setting out the order of stories, and you decided, well, these two kind of call to each other, and so we'll put them on opposite ends of the book?
Yeah, so very much the latter. Bill had the great idea. I always knew that American Girlfriend is kind of the grounding story of this collection. It inhabits a lot of the themes that all the other stories do as well. And, and I wrote it a really long time before I wrote Sparkle Time. So the organization of it was very much done. Bill was like, I think we should start with Sparkle Time, that very short, like, interlude note that kicks off, again, a lot of the themes in this collection. And also it does bookend very nicely with American Girlfriend. And I think Sparkle Time in particular, I can talk about the inspiration of that one, but that was one. So, like many other American ninth graders, I read A&M by John Updike in English class that year. And I've always been a writer, but I always credit that story. And that is a story, I'm not sure if you've read it. It's basically,
No,
I think if you read it, it encompasses, like, my whole thing very well. I'll send you a link or something afterwards. But it's a very short story by American writer John Updike, and it's this grocery store worker who is essentially, like, again, perving is a funny word to put it, because he kind of is, but he's kind of isn't, on these, like, younger girls walking through this grocery store in a beach town in the 60s. And the story ends with his manager being like, girls, you can't be wearing swimsuits in here. And it's, a lot of it is about, like, about the changing sort of social norms at the time of, what you could wear and decorum. And, I think the guy who is the narrator in that story, he ends up quitting and storming out because he's like, justice for these adorable girls in the grocery store in their swimsuits who just want to shop. And that story in particular, I've always been a writer. I wrote stories obviously way before freshman year of high school, but that was a story where I was like, this is such a gross and, like, obtuse story in that, and how he very objectively describes these girls and how they look. And I loved it. And I think that's something in my writing that comes through too. And it comes through in Sparkle Time is almost an odd answer to A&M by John Updike. Instead of this sort of, like, these changing times notion, it becomes more like this narrator's, lack of faith and maybe what he's trying to fill it with. And his descriptions of the girls and how sort of, like, cruel and ugly he can be about it were very much pulled from Updike. That is, like, the story that definitely changed, where I was, like, my writing in the time where I was like, everything can actually be really gross. And I loved it. I love that story so much. And people can be really ugly. And when I was writing that story, actually, so that's one too, where I think, this writer, this narrator searching for something. Smaller tangent. When I sent the collection over to Bill originally, so that story was published in back in 2022 with a online magazine, and the story originally appeared much closer to originally was submitted much closer to how it appears in Utter Goodness. And I'm not going to name the magazine, but it's obviously in the back of the book. But, and to their credit, they did a great job editing it otherwise. And it was nominated for Best of the Net. And I'm very grateful that they did publish it. But one of the things that they did in edits that they suggested was like, we really need to like give this narrator like a gender. Because this is really probably offensive if it comes off, if it's like a male narrator. And I had purposefully written the story so that you don't know if it's a man or a woman narrating the book, because this is totally like androgynous person that I think can read as both female or male. And obviously the story takes on some different meaning there depending on who you read it as. And that was really fun to work with when I was writing it. And they were like, no, we need to gender this. And we should make it a woman so it's not like he's like objectifying these girls at the church. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. Fine, let's make it a woman. We'll give her church shoes. And it was published as that. And when I first talked with Bill about the collection and the stories, literally one of the first things he mentioned, not having read the reason I submitted the version that was in that magazine, and he was like, how would you feel if we made like the narrator in Sparkle Time like not a woman or like completely? And I was like, Bill, you're not going to believe this. It was originally written without this being literally anyone. And that was and then that's what I was like, I need to work with this guy. This is fantastic.
He's good
here. And so that was a small tangent about that story where I was like, yeah, this is, he sees the vision of this. And I'm very happy that it's getting published in its closer to original form.
Yeah. I just straight up assumed that the narrator in Sparkle Time was a guy.
Yeah, I think it's fun to take it on either way, but just so when you read it in the future, if you do a third read, it's one of those things where I'm not someone who likes to hammer the reader over the head. You should read it like this, but it's super fun to hear like how people read it too.
I will bear that in mind. Yeah. One thing I did like quite a lot too is you do play with different writing techniques in a bunch of these stories. Like in Harvesting Bunnies, you've just got so many parenthetical statements. You're calling back to this woman's job and all sorts of other thoughts she's having. You'll denote speech in different ways, like with quotation marks or just italics in line. Are they are you pairing these techniques to, say, a character in the book? It's like, this character, like the character in Harvesting Bunnies, is just so wrapped up in her own head that the constant parentheses really makes sense, and it feels like, I guess, occupying her subjectivity. Like that makes a lot of sense in the context of that character. What is coming first? The writing technique you're wanting to play with, or the character? Or you're just not sure?
Certainly the character. And I think a lot of that technique, especially in dialogue that I use, ends up coming from who that character is. When I wrote Harvesting Bunnies, I'm like, this is a delusional, neurotic woman. So I liked the idea that I could use parentheticals and italics to keep these run-on sentences and run-on thoughts going. I really wanted to have that, again, neurotic, anxious feeling inside of her head. I will say in editing, my use of em dashes and italics is like everyone's nightmare. I'm like, I'm sorry, none of these make sense, but we did get it all worked out. My friend David is a fantastic editor as well. He's gone through some of my stories before, and he's like, have you ever used the em dash correctly? I'm like, no. But I think that getting to use something like, and also I'll pull from the Swans, like there are a lot of italics used in that, used more as a way to designate like this background chatter. These aren't characters that the author, the narrator, Jennifer is immediately like interacting with, or frankly, like when she does talk with them, people that she particularly cares about. And so their words are italicized because they become more just this like background squawking, less than their words actually need to have the designation of quotes. And so I think that I write using, like, again, hypotheses and hypotheses. Oh my God. italices and parentheticals, because it helps, even though it may not always be the most correct, if you will, it helps the stories read in the way that I want the reader to narrate them to themselves. I think that when you're reading something, obviously reading something in a parenthetical or in italics comes off differently, and it serves a different purpose in these stories than just quotes or normal dialogue. So that was certainly done. There's different purposes for those. And I think it's something that if you pick up on it when you're reading it, fantastic. And I think that a lot of readers, as you did, will pick up on it. And it would read very differently if I was to just use straight like dialogue quotes, or if in Harvesting Bunnies I wasn't using parentheticals and breaking them up into different sentences. I think that that would introduce an entirely different voice that is maybe not one that I want to work with in that story.
Yeah, it's nice and textural. I guess, yeah, like you said, even if someone doesn't notice it consciously, it really changes the feel of a story. Even that nice flow-on effect, like you said, of keeping speech in italics rather than a new line with quotation marks, really changes up the flow of the piece in a very nice way. I wanted to ask about Engineer, actually, because you just mentioned offhand that you know Anna Krivlapova. Did she inspire that piece? Because I feel like Engineer could have been written by her, and not just because it involves Russians. Like, that really felt like something that could have been in one of her, like a short story collection by her.
Oh my gosh. It did it not inspired by her. Definitely someone who she was the first person I sent it to. I think I spoke about earlier utter goodness bouncing around in my head. And at the time I get these phrases that'll just go around. I have to get them out on the paper for however weeks or many months they're in there. And for Engineer, I was taking like online Russian classes, and the word, I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'm going to butcher it. I haven't taken these in a while, but the word for, as it's mentioned in the story, engineer in Russian, sounds a lot like ingenue in English. It kind of has that same ange sound. And at the time too, I was reading Proust and I was having a conversation with my friend Chris and about like, ingenues, and muses, and that phonetic similarity between engineer and ingenue really stuck with me. That is actually where this whole story started, is I wanted this like back and forth between engineer and ingenue. And obviously engineer in Russian. And I had also just watched Badlands, and I loved this idea of this like tense college situationship. I don't know what he's doing here, but I don't know what else to do with myself, sort of a thing. And I think so that story kind of spiraled from there. Also at the time, I think that was after Salman Rushdie was stabbed. But that was the idea too of this extremely prosecuted, right? I was also reading a lot of Russian literature at the time. So the idea that these writers could be very prosecuted, it was very, I'll go back to this too. Like, I was reading Bolaño at the time as well. And I had this joke of like poets and writers, you know, in Chile, they used to be like just chased out because they were seen and they were the first to go. And this happened in obviously the Soviet Union too. A lot of writers were the first to, you know, be disappeared, if you will. Because writing at the time obviously had a much larger purpose than it maybe does now in culture. People read a lot more. People, you know, were more influenced by these writers' works. And if you were, you know, writing about ideas that maybe didn't go with what your country wanted, you would never be seen again. So a lot of them were on the run. And I was like, it's really funny to me, the idea that like, if you were a writer in you know, Chile or the Soviet Union, you either needed to get out or really behave or, you know, say love, you know, goodbye. And you're going to a work camp, you're being killed, whatever, you're being thrown into the ocean. And now like it's like, oh, you're a poet, maybe I'll get your face on a postage stamp. And that difference in that purpose of writers was really interesting to me. And I think Salman Rushdie is like probably one of the last or at least current really notable versions of this, obviously, because he had, you know, I think it's Iran that has like we got to kill this guy. I forget the word for it. The Ayatollah was like
fatwa on him for
fatwa. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so that was right after he had been knifed. I think maybe not right after, but it was around that time when I started to write this story. And so again, you're going to hear like a lot of these conflicting or different ideas coming together. So I'm like the Salman Rushdie getting knifed, engineer. And at one point I'll pull in a little, so that was a story where it's like, yeah, I think Anna, I was like, when I wrote this, I was like, Anna's going to love this. It was not necessarily inspired by her, but that was like a bit about, again, just all the things I'm pulling in from my life. I briefly like went on a couple dates many years ago with a guy who was Russian and had gone to Penn, and explained to me that like, and he majored in like nuclear engineering or something, but the United States like kept a really close eye on him. He always had to like check in with like the visa offices and stuff, because they're basically like, you majored in nuclear engineering at Penn, we aren't letting you go back to Russia with this information since learned. So we're really going to keep you here, and we're really going to keep a close eye on you. I mean, he had to go in like weekly to talk to like immigration people or whatever. And, you know, if they thought he was sending information back home, like would be like deported. And I was like, that's super interesting. Not something I had thought about before. I don't know what he was doing. None of my business. We only went on a couple dates. But so all these things kind of came together, this like dating, these weird stories, ingenue engineer. And so the Russian theme popped up a lot here again and again of like these prosecuted writers. Obviously the guy I went on a date with, and then the language as well. So that is where I think the Russian quality got really pulled in from there.
Also actually I won't even say it, because engineer particularly is so short. It's just saying almost anything about it is a spoiler, and you'll lose the fun of that first reading of it. But yeah, there are a lot of qualities of it that felt like an Anna Krivolapova piece, and I definitely mean that as a compliment.
I think Anna's writing is fantastic. She's certainly been both like a mentor and also someone who I think I've menteed at this. I don't even know if that's the right word. I think we both write stories where we write what we want to read, and that becomes just so fun, of course. And I was gonna say, when I think I first sent it to her. And one of the reasons we've talked about this before, all the stakes in her stories are very high. And that is also an extremely like 0 to 100 high stakes story. And that I think is also why it may read, and that wasn't necessarily done with the thought of Anna in mind, but it is certainly why it may read like one of her stories too.
That's a very good way to describe it.
I think when she read Utter Goodness, maybe it wasn't Utter Goodness at first. She read another one of my stories and she was like, oh, I want to up the stakes more. And I was like, I forget which one it was. It may have been one that I haven't published. But I was like, that's really funny because, yeah, all the stakes and all these endings in your stories tend to be so high and so high energy, and what's it cost? And Engineer is a story where literally everything is at cost. So.
So before wrapping up, are there any other things that that you've done that you want people to be aware of? Like, you on Twitter, you've got your tinned fish thing going there that I don't. I guess just because I cook because I'm an animal for macronutrients. It's like the specific tinned fish beyond just the macros on the back aren't really things I consider. But anything like that, other works of yours, other places that people can find you, anything like that you want to mention before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I am on Twitter as @tinnedfishmonger, tinned without the E because Twitter had a character limit, so you'll find me. John Didion is my screen name. I write a Substack, John, JAWN, Didion.substack.com. It's called Audrey's America. it's some mix of essays and personal taste, a lot about utter goodness, of course. And I also find me on my website at audreymorganlee.com. But that's mostly where you will want to find me, at least online. I will
Beautiful.
mention as well, the Philadelphia release party for Utter Goodness is going to be January 22nd, 6:30 p.m. at Photo Lounge on 17th Street. You can find information on that on any of my socials or Farthest Heaven's socials as well.
Nice. And for listeners, I really, really recommend this book. Like if you haven't already gone to the Farthest Heaven link in the show notes, I really recommend you do. Pick up a copy. It's really great. And thanks for jumping on. And for everyone listening, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.